This entire semester we've been learning about art. We started with the ancient classics, then we moved on to colonialism, and now we're finally studying modernism. But today, right now, we're going to look at a different form of art, one that involves pictures like the ones just displayed, except they're moving. If you haven't already guessed, we're going to take a look at movies, but not just any movies, those of Latin America. We'll be looking at 3 specific countries, Cuba, then Argentina, then Brazil. Let's jump right in, shall we? Enter Cuba, 1906, March 25th. The very first Cuban film, El Parque de Palatino, is created by Enrique Diaz Quesada. Granted, the film is only 1 minute long. Nonetheless, a film is a film. The Havana Film Festival New York website summarizes it as the inauguration of a new center in the neighborhood El Cerro in Havana. Now, this short was made before the second occupation of Cuba, which involved President Theodore Roosevelt ordering military forces on the island. El Parque de Palatino, no matter how jarring the footage may seem to the average eye, is a simple sliver of joy. This 1 minute represents a single moment of freedom for Cuba, which even today hardly knows the meaning of the word. Let's fast forward quite a bit. January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro wins the revolution. Less than 3 months after this fateful New Year's Eve, Cuba's new government installs the ICAIC, or El Instituto Cubano de Arte y Industria Cinematográficos. This changed everything for Cuban cinema. Documentarist and researcher John Meraz quotes the ICAIC in his research essay, stating how the institute described Cuba's history as a veritable goldmine of themes and heroes capable of cinematic incarnation. Of course, this was quite a stretch for a country that had changed overnight due to a revolting of its people against its primary leader. Yet despite these obstacles, Cuba did not back down from its cinematic and artistic goals. Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, one of the country's most renowned directors, was the visionary behind the iconic Memories of Underdevelopment. Alea's film follows protagonist Sergio, a self-absorbed man who is left behind by his wife and children after they escape Havana for the United States. Alea's piece is best described by Alejandro Veciana of how Memories of Underdevelopment playfully mixes verite elements like newsreels and shots of average citizens with more constructed, stylized shots. In other words, Alea's groundbreaking piece allows for a complex representation of a country that has been worn down by political fatigue and a loss of direction, which is embodied by Sergio himself. Soon after came Humberto Solas's Lucia, following the intricate stories of 3 different women named, you guessed it, Lucia. This film won first place at the Moscow Film Festival in 1969, but it didn't get released in the States until 1974 due to the U.S.-Cuba embargo. One last director to discuss is the fierce Sara Gomez, Cuba's first ever female film director. Joining the ICAIC as Alea's apprentice in 1961, she was referred to as a disastrous assistant director. Nonetheless, she quickly recovered with her distinct look at Afro-Cuban perspectives and revolutionary culture, especially with women. A few of her works include short documentaries such as Ida a Santiago, Isla del Tesoro, and Plaza Vieja. When the 1970s came along, the short-lived golden age for Cuban cinema began to fade. Remezcla describes how the revolution had strayed from its idealistic origins and began to favor bread-and-butter issues like agricultural production over revolutionary cultural practice. Cuban cinema barely persevered under repressive conditions, but renowned directors like Nicolás Landrian were forced to flee persecution for their provocative works. The Revista Harvard column echoes this downfall. In the 1990s, Cuba underwent a terrible economic crisis in which cinematic production came to a halt altogether. After almost going completely bankrupt, the island's cinematic aspirations were salvaged via co-productions with other, wealthier nations such as Spain. Examples of successful co-productions include Fresa y Chocolate, La Vida es Silbar, and Sweet Havana. Despite walking on eggshells in terms of political and social issues, Cuba has still managed to pave its way into cinema with innovation, passion, and creativity.
My name is Liliana Torres, and today I will talk about and explain the history of the cinema in Argentina. To begin, the history of the Argentine cinema happened from 1896 to 1945. According to El Sur del Sur website, where I made my research, the Lumieres in the year 1896 made the first film. The Lumieres were brothers that would become one of the first filmmakers. Kinetoscope, which is a machine that would help project the images that would become very useful in the filmmaking, were introduced in 1896. Eugene Py, that was French but lived in Argentina, became a filmmaker and cameraman for the short movie The Argentine Flag. French cameras started to arrive in Argentina by 1897. This was a coincidence because a Frenchman would be using a French camera in Argentina. Also, in the research that I made, it said that by the 1900s there were theaters already showing films. There would also be news reports starting to be filmed. By 1907, essays of sound, as the research says, were created. Sound would also help explain a mood in a story by the background sounds displayed. By 1933, sound films were becoming very popular and many people would go to the theaters to see them. A film named Tango by Luis Mongolia Barth, and also the film The Three Whims by Enrique T. Susini and Luis Andrini were some of the films displayed at this time. Some people talked about tango for a long time. There was a lot of family moments where they would get together and watch a film. After 1933, there was about 30 films done per year, which would then be exported to other Latin American places. The director Libertad Lamarque made melodramas, which were films that were including dramatic stories with an exaggeration of characters. The directors Sandrini and Nini Marshall made comic films, which were also very popular at the time. By 1938, there was about 29 theaters that would have good equipment for people to attend these theaters. As years passed, more and more people started getting new ideas on how to create more films. According to the Brown University Library, the third wave of cinema in Argentina was an important one. Daniel Gonin, the writer of the Brown article, discussed how Argentinian filmmakers sought to review the values, histories, and hegemonic culture of the nation. This included directors such as Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino. Their film, La Hora de los Hornos, pushed boundaries in filmmaking with revolutionary thinking and a radical push for change. Overall, Argentina has a rich history of filmmaking that has been celebrated by not only Latin America, but also by the rest of the world. New technology nowadays has an important role on how the movies will come out. The better production, the more people will get entertained and will more likely go to the theaters to watch these films.
We interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
Cinematography was invented in 1891 by the American Thomas Edison and his assistant, Laurie Dixon. However, it was the French brothers Louis and Auguste Lumiere who actually made it popular in the city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, around 1897. A cinema called Salo from Novidades, Paris, opened, and the first official film was shot in 1898 on a boat, Vista de Bahia de Guanabara, which was the work of an Italian immigrant, Alfonso Segreto. His country of origin was quickly forgotten, and on July 19th, it was declared as Brazilian Film Day, and Vista de Bahia de Guanabara was the first official film screened in Rio, which is a silent film in black and white. In the years between 1908 and 1912, it was called the Bela Época, the Golden Age, because films were being produced as 100 films per year. At the time, Brazil was creating Pose films, and the very first one created was Os Estranguladores by Francisco Marzullo, released in 1908. Following that, Sung films were later being introduced and were very successful for Brazilian audiences. Later on, no matter how much success these films had, they unfortunately lacked originality. This eventually caused a downfall for Brazilian film in the 1910s. The lack was also noticed by the audience, especially when North American films started to be introduced. Brazilian public started to turn a blind eye on their local films and started to look at current blockbusters. In the end of the First World War, networks were being created in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Niterói, Belo Horizonte, Juiz de Fora, to promote foreign films, which were mostly American films in the 1920s. It was an extreme expense of early Brazilian cinema. Despite this downfall, the arriving of talking pictures, which is a sound film with scrutinized sound and dialogue, in 1927, gave Brazil an opportunity to produce a first sound film called Abracadam Setoroi, 1929, by Luis de Barros. In 1930, a law was passed making North American films an expensive customs tax. This was very effective and another opportunity for Brazilian films to be introduced. Films were being produced by newly created production houses. One of the greatest Brazilian directors, Humberto Mauro, took advantage of this moment and made his masterpiece, Ganga Bruta, in 1933. This film is based upon violence of feelings. Cinema was basically a battleground to fight for Brazilian national identity. Director, actor, and screenwriter Glauber Rocha states, an evolving complex of films that will ultimately make the public aware of its own misery. Film is a way of art to express oneself or ideas, and in this case, it is a perfect way to explore Brazil's culture. This idea of a collective identity is part of Brazil's cinema history. One of the greatest silent films is Limit, 1931, by Mario Puzo, which is basically about 3 refugees in a lifeboat that crashed and talked about their life stories and about finding truth from multiple views and state of being. Despite downfalls of Brazilian film, in the 1940s, groups of investors and bankers from São Paulo did everything to promote Brazilian cinema all around and nationally. Studios were being built in Veracruz, which offered grade A equipment to filmmakers. During the 1960s, democracy was undermined by an authoritarian military dictatorship. Films intensified political struggle, which were Luis Sergio's Prison, São Paulo, S.A., 1965. Carlos Diegues, A Grande Cidade, The Big City, 1966, and Glauber Rocha's Terra em Trance, Land in Anguish, 1967. This was where cinema novo came into play, where the melancholy mood was captured in underground films. Additionally, in the 1970s, Brazil began to shine when entrepreneurs went into play. In 1966, the National Film Institute, INC, was created to cast Brazilian films commercially, and Elba Filme, 1969, to be able to cast film abroad. In 1989, the country experienced the most democratic election in over a century, and film production fell. Brazilian film never gave up despite financial crisis and being stepped over politically. In 1998, Bruno Barreto's O Que Hizo Companheiro, 4 Days in September, was nominated for the U.S. Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and Walter Sales' Central Station won the top prize, the Golden Bear, at the Berlin International Film Festival.
This has been the history of Latin American cinema featuring Cuba, Argentina, and Brazil. This project was made by Barbara Lopez, Estela Sanchez, and Liliana Torres. Thank you so much for tuning into our timeline, and we hope you enjoyed it.